Sex, either of the two main categories, male and female, into which humans and most other living things are divided on the basis of their reproductive functions. The whole issue with gender theists saying that sex is a spectrum is that they fundamentally misunderstand what a phenotype is. They also misunderstand many other things, but phenotype seems to be one of their most pivotal errors. However, in order to properly understand a phenotype, we must first understand the difference between isogamy and anisogamy. Sexually reproductive species are either isogamous, which means they produce one-sized gamete, or anisogamous, which means they produce two different sized gametes. Anisogamous is otherwise known as sexual dimorphism. Isogamous reproduction is most commonly associated with single-celled organisms. That seems to be part of the reason why anisogamy developed. It appears to allow for more complicated life forms. The period when all life was isogamous was back when life on Earth was basically little more than different types of aquatic mold. What is important to note about organisms that reproduce through isogamy is that they still have different kinds of gametes. However, the gametes are not different sizes, and as a result of this, instead of being classified as male, female, or as a sex, they are instead known in scientific literature as plus or minus mating types. This is how essential gamete size is to determining the sex of an organism. In fact, a species can get so close as to be producing two different gametes, but so long as those gametes are the same size, it still doesn't qualify as a sex. Now, just as the concepts of isogamy and anisogamy cover all sexually reproductive species, so too does the definition of male, female, and sex. As a result, these terms cannot be defined by characteristics that are specific to humans. They must be defined by characteristics that all sexually dimorphic species have in common, even the plants. This is where phenotype comes in. Phenotype is one of the few things that it would be possible for such varied species to have in common. But in order to understand how this trait can be shared across species, it is necessary to understand what a phenotype actually is. One of the easiest ways to illustrate phenotype is to make an analogy to the categories left and right, specifically as they apply to clothing such as shoes or gloves. The analogy is that, for example, a male phenotype is structured around small gametes, or a female phenotype is structured around large gametes, the way a left shoe is structured around the left foot. This is how it is possible, despite the limitless potential of modern shoes, to divide them into left and right based on each shoe having a complementary role depending on its position in the pair. A similar dynamic allows for sexually dimorphic phenotype categories to cross completely different species that otherwise have very little in common. On the other hand, if you ask a gender theist what a phenotype is, they will immediately start talking about various ratios of the differences between male and female humans specifically. They'll mention stuff like height, body fat, or hormones, but this is looking at the arrow instead of what it's pointing to. The real question is, what is the reproductive significance of these various differences? Remember, sex, either of the two main categories, male and female, into which humans and most other living things are divided on the basis of their reproductive function. So if it isn't possible to convey any biological information through a particular category, then it can't be a biological sex category. For example, if one were to put forward a conceptual lens which only applied to humans and no other species, and even then it merely sorted people into various degrees of kind of masculine or kind of feminine, while no doubt entertaining for all, such a framework would be totally insufficient to qualify as a biological sex. On this note, we are now in a position to revisit a concept explored in earlier videos, which is that gender theists have crazy ideas about what intersex conditions actually consist of, and their absolute most treasured fantasy is a human hermaphrodite. This would be a person who, by virtue of having functioning ovaries and testicles, would technically be capable of reproducing with themselves. In regards to this overwhelmingly hypothetical demographic, the position taken by gender theists are varying degrees of incorrect, depending on how misinformed or zealous about their beliefs the particular believer happens to be. However, as will become clear, this isn't about them having any particular concern for intersex people. The only reason they have any knowledge about intersex conditions at all is because they think that if they can argue that certain intersex people do not have a distinct sex, then they will be able to appropriate that status of ambiguity for themselves, which will then enable them to erase all sex categories, which is their stated priority. So gender theists are often not just focused on intersex conditions, but even within this field, they are concerned with some of the most rare conditions imaginable. Just as they appropriate the term assigned sex at birth from a specifically intersex experience, gender theists will appropriate any terminology that they think will help them justify their positions. The term triggered is an example of this process at work. However, even in a species where hermaphroditic reproduction is typical, the existence of hermaphrodites doesn't erase the definition of male or female. What is important to consider in this regard is that humans don't just have one phenotype, like a sock, but they also do not have three phenotypes either, as would be the case with a spoon, a fork, and a spork. While this might seem like an unnecessary consideration, three phenotypes is one conceptual possibility for there to have been humans who had phenotypes that were organized around the simultaneous production of both gametes. Using the footwear metaphor, this would instead be shoes that were specifically organized to support both a left and right foot interchangeably. Instead of being a left or a right shoe, this would be a left as well as a right shoe. The problem for gender theists is that when cross-sex gonads appear in humans, it's not like when this occurs in species that actually has a phenotype that is organized around hermaphroditic reproduction, which can occur in a number of ways. For example, some species like clownfish swap between phenotype. This is known as a sequential hermaphrodite. Alternatively, there are species that have a single phenotype that is organized to support the production of both gametes simultaneously, like these penis fencing slugs. Species like these are known as simultaneous hermaphrodites. In stark contrast, in the rare instances when humans even come close to something approximating hermaphroditism, the only possible options are for either there to be internal testes in a female phenotype or internal ovaries in a male phenotype, which is another way of saying that while a specific phenotype may have components of the other sex, it is nonetheless still specifically organized around a separate function. We've all been raised on Tumblr to believe that one day we'd all be clownfish and seahorses and penis-fencing slugs. But we won't. And we're slowly learning that fact. And we're very, very pissed off. Mouthfeel, yeah. Another problem gender theists have is with the idea that infertility changes or in some way overrides or replaces an organism's biological sex. They don't understand that a phenotype is about how bodies are grouped within species around the production of a particular gamete, and not whether a gamete is currently being produced in any given example. That would be the equivalent of thinking that if a left shoe was put on a right foot, it would no longer be a left shoe. But we know that it would remain a left shoe because its entire structure is organized around the left foot, regardless of how it is being used at the time, or even if, for whatever reason, it is no longer functional. In such a case, it would then be a broken left shoe. It would not suddenly have the possibility of being a sock or a refrigerator or a right shoe. So now we have a framework. Let's look at Riley's research document. It reads, "But there are many documented examples of individuals who do fit into both categories. Individuals who are both biologically male and female, they have both ovaries and testes and can produce both sperm and eggs." Wow, that sounds exciting. However, having actually looked at the sources Riley cites, I believe that there is so much factually and conceptually flawed about this sentence that it is difficult to know where to begin. So, setting aside the specific definition of biological sex for a second, the sources provided mention precisely one man from the 1980s where there appeared to be evidence that he had produced ova at some prior point in addition to having fertile sperm. Firstly, finding only one 40-year-old possible case for something which there are apparently many documented examples of, seems a bit unusual. Secondly, a phenotype is a structure that is organized around the production of a particular gamete. So, for example, if a uterus was implanted in a male phenotype, that would still be a male phenotype despite producing the other gamete, because it would be socially and not structurally organized towards this function. Thinking that adding a uterus to a male phenotype would make a new phenotype is like thinking sewing a pigeon to a rat would constitute a new species.
I made a pigeon rat.
A phenotype is an organism that is organized toward the production of a particular gamete, not just any organism that happens to contain said gamete. This is a subtle but important distinction. It works the same way that a left shoe is any shoe that is structured around the left foot, and not any shoe being worn on a left foot. So, even if cross-sex gamete production was possible in humans, the definition of male and female would still exist, as would male and female phenotypes. The fact that something is organized around both gametes does not automatically imply that everything must be this way. Just because socks apply to either foot doesn't mean shoes do as well. Having a phenotype organized around the production of sperm is not the same as currently producing sperm. So, for a different example, if random genetic variation hypothetically caused an extra set of gametes to appear in a human being, as was suggested to be the case in the paper Riley pointed to, these gametes would still nonetheless be contained inside either a male or female phenotype. The body would physically be structured towards the production of one gamete as opposed to the other, just as putting a left shoe on a right foot doesn't make it a right shoe. A similar dynamic is at play when a female phenotype develops out of male chromosomes or vice versa. Incidentally, the history of having two types of shoes is somewhat similar to the development of having two sizes of gametes. Originally, just as isogamous reproduction preceded anisogamous sexual dimorphism, likewise, it wasn't until 1818 that the right shoe was invented. Until that time, there was no distinction between shoes made for left or right feet. However, once the phenotypes, so to speak, of a left shoe and a right shoe were put into development, it was not necessary for any particular pair of shoes to actually be worn by anyone in order for them to maintain their definition as left and right shoes respectively. Even partially complete, they still have distinct but complementary patterns of organization. You can even put the inner sole of a right shoe in a left shoe, and it still remains a left shoe. Unfortunately, as for the rest of Riley's resources, they surprisingly do not even claim to mention people who have the ability to produce both gametes. Instead, they mention only people who produce the one regular gamete, or, in the case of one XX male, no gametes at all, which, for those keeping count, would be two less than needed to qualify. Interestingly, one of the sources Riley provided also mentions a condition which again only produced one gamete, but also was so rare that it was only the 17th recorded case in existence. Actually, it says, on review of the literature, we noted only 10 previous documented cases of fertility in a true hermaphrodite. So they're really scraping the bottom of the barrel looking for loopholes. Far from, quote, people who have both ovaries and testes and can produce both sperm and eggs, end quote, being something that there are apparently, quote, many examples of, end quote, it is instead the case that we see Riley, captain of the Human Hermaphrodite Defense League, someone who could not be more invested in finding human hermaphrodites, and yet he still struggles to put forward even one confirmed example. The real problem is, even if Riley found what he is looking for, it would not prove what Riley thinks it would. To use one last analogy, let's say that the world is broken up into two different groups, clocks and radios. But in this world, some people don't want to be clocks or even radios. So they decide that if they could only prove that there was such a thing as a clock radio, it would destroy the definition of both clocks and radios, at which point they could be free to be a toaster or some shit. The problem is that the existence of a clock radio does not disrupt the definition of a clock or a radio, nor did the invention of clock radios mean that clocks and radios henceforth inherently existed on a spectrum. Furthermore, there are no actual clock radios when it comes to humans, i.e., no third phenotype which is structured to support the production of both gametes simultaneously. Instead, the closest humans come to this is either radios with bits of clock in them, or clocks with bits of radio. But a phenotype is about the organization of the whole system, and even if such a system was proven to exist, it still wouldn't change the fact that there is an objective binary difference between a clock and a radio.
Ooh, hear that pin drop? Told the doc I was sick of looking at ink blots.
Marking a significant shift away from using a binary model for explaining biological sex, here is a graphic from Scientific American describing the many characteristics which factor into one's sexual identity. This shows the ambiguous and bimodal nature of sex, and that sex is not as simple as XX or XY. Biological sex is on a bimodal distribution, not a direct binary.
Every assurance just magnifies the doubt.